Yeah, hi, thank you. I am Katie Sayre. I am a postdoc with Mike Gurven and the Chimane Health and Life History Project, and I am really looking forward to sharing these results with you from both from two different populations that are being studied within the context of this project. So I think we are all familiar with this idea that we are experiencing a loneliness epidemic right now. Our former US Surgeon General was known for calling attention to how important our loneliness and social isolation are for our health. And of course, the US is not the only population to call attention to this. Both the UK and Japan have appointed a minister of loneliness. Um, and loneliness and social isolation are very closely related, but they are distinct concepts. So social isolation is the objective lack of social contacts or interactions with other people, being alone, while loneliness is the subjective, distressing feeling of not having enough social interaction, so feeling lonely. And I'm sure we all know that the health effects of loneliness and social isolation really were highlighted for a lot of us during the pandemic, but decades of work before COVID-19 already supported a strong connection between our social relationships and our health. Loneliness and social isolation have impacts on our mortality risk, physical and cognitive function, our cardiometabolic health, our sleep, our stress response. And these are problems for people of all ages. Loneliness generally follows a U-shaped curve with the highest levels seen among younger and older adults. And for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to focus on older adults for a couple of reasons. First, the age-related changes in physical and cognitive function that are normal with aging um, may make older adults more susceptible to or may exacerbate the negative health effects of loneliness and social isolation. And second, of course, as many of you have already pointed out, the proportion of older adults is increasing in populations around the globe, especially in lower and middle income contexts. So we see a high prevalence of loneliness among older adults in high income contexts. 1 in 4 older adults in the US and almost 1 in 5 in England is lonely. And one of the common myths about loneliness is that people living in more individualistic countries or cultures are lonelier than those living in more familial or socially embedded contexts. And that trend really doesn't seem to hold true, at least in high income contexts. But of course, I don't need to tell all of you that most of our data on this is from higher income contexts. The data that we do have from lower and middle income contexts suggests that actually, yes, older adults in these contexts do experience loneliness. About 10 to 25% of older adults experience loneliness in low and middle income countries. And that is about the same range that we see in other countries like the US. So some researchers have suggested that certain aspects of our modern lives, like our consumerism and our reliance on the market economy, are responsible and contribute to the epidemic of loneliness we see in places like the United States. But so far, there has not been a formal examination of what loneliness and social isolation look like in places where there is less reliance on the market economy. Specifically, we don't have data on loneliness or social isolation in subsistence-oriented populations where people do live in highly socially embedded contexts, and also importantly, where people's reliance on the market economy is shifting. Which brings me to the present study with the Chimane and Moseten. These are two forager horticulturalist populations in Bolivia. So in this study, we're using data from the Chimane Health and Life History Project. This is a longitudinal project that my co-author, Mike Gurven, founded in 2002, or co-founded in 2002. Initially, the work was just with the Chimane, who practice subsistence level foraging, fishing, and small-scale farming. In 2015, the project expanded data collection to add the Moseten, who are ethno-linguistically very similar to the Chimane. They are also traditionally foraging and forager horticulturalists. But importantly, their assimilation into the broader Bolivian society began several decades before it did for the Chimane. So as a result, the most attend communities have better access to schools and medical care and the market economy. They are more market integrated, we could say, than the Tsimane. So if consumerism and market economies are responsible for or lead to higher levels of loneliness, then we might expect the Mosatan to be lonelier than the Tsimane. So for this, to examine whether the Mosatan are lonelier or more socially isolated than the Tsimane, we used interview data and focal follow data from collected between 2019 and 2024 from approximately 500 participants, 55 and older. We used marital status, household size, the number of family members in your community, and the number of people you interact with across a given hour to evaluate social isolation. And we used an adapted 3-item UCLA loneliness scale to evaluate loneliness. We tallied up responses to these questions and created a loneliness score with a range from 3 to 9 points, and then used the common cutoff of 6 points to categorize people as either lonely or not lonely. So I will begin with our social isolation variables. First of all, on the whole, most people do not seem to be socially isolated. Marital status, for example, most people are married. In this figure, and in the next several slides, you'll see the Tsimane represented on the left and the Mosatan on the right. Yellow here is the proportion of individuals in these different age categories who are married, and navy or dark blue up here is the proportion who are unmarried. And we can see that most people are married, and also that the proportion of people who are unmarried does increase with age or is higher among the people who are 75 and older. On the whole, more Mosatan are unmarried compared to the Tsimane. Most people do not live alone. Here, the yellow indicates the proportion of people in these age categories who live with at least one other person, while the blue here is living by yourself. Once again, we see higher proportions of individuals 75 and older who live by themselves. Average household size is a bit larger in the Tsimane compared to the Mosatan, and the Mosatan, a higher percent of the Mosatan live alone compared to the Tsimane. But again, vast majority of people live with at least one other person. Most people live in communities where they have several family members nearby. So this measure does not include people living in the same household. On the whole, Tsimane have on average 22 family members or related kin living in their communities, and most of the 10 have 17 or 18. So yes, there are fewer family members nearby for the most of 10 compared to the Tsimane, but this is a high number of family members nearby for both of these groups. And then finally, for social isolation variables, most people do interact with other people during a given hour. That's what the yellow indicates here, is interacting with at least one other person. The blue here is the proportion of people who don't interact with anyone across a given hour. And you can see, especially for the Tsimane, that's higher for the 75 plus group. Tsimane seem to have, on the whole, more hourly interact with more people in an hour than the Mosatan do. But again, I want to point out that most people interact with others. So while the Mosatan social isolation variables are generally higher than the variables for the Tsimane, I wouldn't say that either of these groups is highly socially isolated, though I will point out that the people ages 75 and older do stand out as having higher measures of social isolation than those younger than 75. We found that most people are not lonely. Here, this blue dotted line represents 6 points. This is a figure showing loneliness score on the y-axis and age on the x-axis. Tsimane is here in orange or red, and Mosatan are purple, and each dot here represents one observation, and you can see that the vast majority of people fall below 6 points on the loneliness score. I'll also point out that there is an age-related difference in loneliness score, and this is also true for loneliness status. For the sake of time, I'm just showing a score right here. But we see that among 75 and older participants have a higher loneliness score compared to those younger. And then somewhat surprisingly, we found that the Mosatan actually have on the whole lower loneliness scores and a lower prevalence of loneliness compared to the Tsimane. So completely opposite from the pattern we saw for the social isolation variables. To put this into a broader context, here is prevalence of loneliness using that same UCLA 3-item scale with a 6-point cutoff among older adults across several other epidemiological longitudinal studies in mostly high-income countries. And you can see that the Tsimane and Mosatan prevalence of loneliness falls well within the range that we see for other populations. So far, what these results indicate is that loneliness and social isolation are present in these contexts. They are not absent, despite these people living in a highly socially embedded context. And they seem especially potentially problematic for people 75 and older. And then we also found that more market integration does not necessarily seem to mean more loneliness. We found that the Mosatan, who are more market integrated, were less lonely than Tsimane. And there are a couple of reasons why we think this could be the case. For one, more market integration in this context does not necessarily mean a sudden increase in screen time or smartphone use. It specifically means that they have better access to medical care, education, and better food security. So it's possible that those things also make it easier to care for older adults who may have different functional or disability statuses. And then also we see that the Mosatan organize more community-wide events than the Tsimane, something that is not captured in the social isolation variables that we looked at. So this photo on the bottom was taken by my co-author, Mike Gurven, last summer when he visited a Mosatan community on the day they were celebrating Elder Appreciation Day. And this kind of community event is not something that we see in the context of the Tsimane. And then there are some reasons we think that this might be a generational effect. This is cross-sectional data, though this is in the context of a longitudinal project, and we're excited to get follow-up data on this. And overall, I think our work highlights the importance of both longitudinal and comparative work, which brings me to my final slide here. We are currently working with several groups to implement a cross-cultural test battery to examine how the social environments of people with different subsistence strategies across the globe see how those different social environments can impact health and well-being in these different contexts. And this kind of comparative work is incredibly important, which I'm sure I don't need to tell the people at this workshop. But this is going to let us document not just the magnitude of the problem of social isolation and loneliness, but also to see how it could manifest differently across these different contexts. So we can see if people with different subsistence strategies and different kinds of reliance on the market economy also have different cultural norms about accommodating age-related changes in social environment or physical and cognitive function. And we are very excited about this. And I'm happy to elaborate more on any of this, but for the sake of time, I'm going to conclude there and thank these generous funding sources and all of the Tsimane and Mosatan participants, as well as our colleagues across several institutions. And also thank you to Will, Eileen, and Ellie for organizing this workshop, and to all of you for your attention. Thank you.